Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
And one thing I would say is, at any complex time in history, when things are very difficult to deal with, you are going to find the rise of that kind of thinking. One of the reasons is because the future is so awesome.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Father Ken Moorman, who is an assistant to Bishop James Hoffman. Father Bacik and Father Moorman will discuss fundamentalism and the end of the world. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Ken, I'm glad that you've taken time to be with me on this program. One of the reasons is I enjoy dialoguing with you. You always try to pick up on the positive side of things that are said and are very affirming and have a nice, gentle way of adding to the point. And I guess I appreciate that kind of conversation. That's part of what John Courtney Murray called civil discourse, that it's necessary in our society to learn to have civil discourse, where we try to argue intelligently, rationally, and make our points, and especially to give the other person the benefit of the doubt or to pick up positively on what they have to say. I think there are obviously more things to dialogue, but that's certainly one part of it. And so, therefore, I would like to talk with you a little bit about one aspect of what is commonly thought of as biblical fundamentalism these days, and that is the notion that the end of the world is approaching soon, that we are in the imminent second coming. Will be coming before long. That, of course, has been a phenomenon that has occurred throughout the whole of Christian history, and we ought to be aware of that. So right at the very beginning of our Christian era, the early disciples of Jesus were into that mode of thinking. They thought that Christ would complete his work soon. They relied on certain statements of Jesus about this generation not passing away, and expected him, therefore, to complete his whole salvific mission very soon in their lifetime. In fact, as I recall it, Paul's letter to the Thessalonians had that as part of the background point involved, that indeed the people were not marrying and doing their jobs and so on because they thought Christ was coming soon. Yeah. I think it's Rosemary Ruth who said that really the whole the New Testament, that great revolution occurred right in that first century there, and is represented in the New Testament writings in this whole outlook on the end of the world.
That's very true, because in the Jewish apocalyptic thought, when the Messiah came, would be the end, and that would bring about this great denouement of history, and so it was a major difficulty at the outset that Christians could claim that Jesus was the Messiah, and yet would have to admit that the end had not yet come. They needed to have room in there, and so the way of understanding what was happening was that Jesus indeed was the Messiah, had begun his work and his earthly appearance, but that now a time was set aside to continue to spread the gospel, to allow all people to accept him as Messiah, and then he would come back. And it was when he came back that we would now pick up the Jewish apocalyptic thought again. The end would occur, the judgment, and the final disposition of things in heaven and earth.
That shows the importance of locating Jesus within the biblical, the Jewish world, doesn't it?
Definitely.
And the apocalyptic expectations of the times. And that when that sentence just jumped out at me, that you said when the Messiah came, that would mean the kingdom was here.
Exactly.
And it was completed, and therefore there was no real room in that apocalyptic outlook for a long period of time.
That's right.
And so it was sort of built into the situation of the first century, wasn't it?
It was, and the assumption was that therefore that is the reason. Maybe I didn't make that clear enough. That is the assumption. That is the reason for the assumption that the intervening time would not be long, because in the preceding way of understanding it was going to be immediate. I ran across a comment just in the last couple of weeks that at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolution, Bar Kokhba was acclaimed by Akiba as the Messiah. And this is now we're in a completely Jewish context. And at that time, when the same problem occurred, that if Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, then why did not we have the Messianic age? And at that time, Akiba made the comment that it would that the intervening time would last 40 years, a generation is the basic idea. But we could see a similar or analogous situation occurring in the Christian community, that whereas Jesus proclaimed, Luke's gospel has this intriguing comment where Jesus says, if I, by the finger of God, am casting out devils among you, if I am healing, if I am raising from the dead, if I am doing all these things that are signs of the kingdom, then know that the kingdom has come upon you. But having to make a distinction then between the kingdom's coming initially and its coming in triumph, its fulfillment when Jesus would come back again, and then all those other prophecies about the lion lying down with the lamb and all the new world, the new heavens and the new earth, those prophecies would now apply.
It's interesting that this phenomenon is rising again in our own time, because there are a number of people, we call them millenarianists. The Latin word for 1,000 is mille, and the notion is based on the book of Revelations about the 1,000 years of peace, either right before Christ comes or right after he comes, one way or the other. But that's where we get that name for them, the millenarianists. They are convinced that the Christ is coming soon, and they often relate it to the signs of the times. That is, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1947 is a very key date for them. They often talk about the importance of the common market and the number of countries that are in it. They talk about earthquakes and the rise of communism and so on, which is seen as the Antichrist. So when they look at the world today, they say, aha, more and more of the signs are appearing, and therefore the end is imminent. Christ will return soon. And of course you get all kind of playoffs of that, then explanations and so on. But you do find that happening, and it is intriguing as to why. And one thing I would say is, at any complex time in history, when things are very difficult to deal with, you are going to find the rise of that kind of thinking. One of the reasons is because the future is so awesome. There's a great deal of fear and anxiety around that unknown future. And there needs to be this strong sense that God is in control, that the good forces are going to win out. And, of course, that, I think, feeds into this whole business of the rise of millenarianism in our own time. There's other factors as well, but at least that is there.
You put your finger on it. In my own experience, I remember one of my professors when I was in college had come from Hungary, and I remember him talking about the mood in his country those immediate weeks before the Red Army invaded, and how apocalyptic literature just went like wildfire, because people could not believe that God would allow this to happen to them, that they who were a good people and a good Christian nation and so forth should be swallowed up this way, that he was going to have to intervene and keep this from happening. And I guess that his description of that mood of the time in his country has always stuck with me as something in common in each generation, as people become very conscious of how evil developments are becoming. That is met with a corresponding hope and certitude that God's going to have to intervene and correct the situation. In terms of apocalyptic thought, it takes the form that Jesus is going to come back again and destroy evil, create a new heavens and new earth.
Strikes me that these millenarianists differ in one respect from many other fundamentalists, and that is they are much more literal in their reading of the Scriptures. It's often a very literal reading of the book of Revelation, or the Apocalypse as we sometimes call it, that accounts for this view of theirs. Now, in biblical fundamentalism as a whole, there's often a sense of reading it symbolically. That is, they are interested in preserving the inerrant character of the Scriptures, no error, and therefore they will read certain passages symbolically in order to preserve the truthfulness of the Scriptures. But what happens with the millenarianists, at least as they look at the book of Revelation, is you get a very literal interpretation. They try to add up numbers that they find in there, so that they often throughout history have come up with exact days when the world was supposed to end. And they always had a problem, of course, when it didn't end. I mean, that was the great problem with this viewpoint, is there often is empirical evidence against you. And I noticed what usually happened is they would go back and say, they wouldn't re-examine their presuppositions. They would go back and say, we calculated wrong.
Yeah, that's right.
And they would sometimes set it up again in the not too far distant future and be wrong again.
Yes.
It's remarkable.
I was thinking, as you were talking about, a very literal interpretation of the book of Revelation or the book of Daniel as well. Yes and no. The numbers are taken very literally, but for example, where the numbers say that the beast shall reign for 1,260 days, well, obviously 1,260 days is long ago past. There must be some other meaning for those days, and then try to find a key that will allow them to interpret that. In that particular example, the passage from the Psalm and also from Peter, one day in your sight is like 1,000 elsewhere, or 1,000 years, is used as a cue that sometimes to figure out days and years can be interchanged. And
a good point. In other words, what you're telling me really is that they end up being very selective, as we would expect from any group, I suppose, in which passages they take literally and which they don't.
That's correct, because the crucial the motivation that fuels the whole effort is to determine when the end is going to occur. And therefore they will take whatever clues that they can find, whatever statements that appear to be helpful in order to accomplish that task. You said it so well. They never examine the presuppositions that they come with, the assumptions that these texts are designed to give a timetable. They go instead to their computations and figure out they must have used the wrong starting date, they must have missed something along the line about how the passage is supposed to be interpreted, and they try again.
One thing that we would do in response to this, of course, is to try to see what the literary form apocalyptic literature is really all about. And let me make a few comments on that, and then you can fill it out. But apocalyptic literature usually results in a time of crisis, as you pointed out with the Hungarian situation, when people need a sense of hope, when they're trying to figure out how to keep going in the midst of all kinds of difficulties. And so apocalyptic literature is meant to be hope-filled in the midst of crisis. And very often it is a secretive kind of literature, or at least it's the kind that needs to be coded in a way, so that if one is in an oppressed situation, that the oppressor perhaps cannot really identify what this literature is really all about. So that in the Bible, what we get is apocalyptic literature in the book of Daniel, and in the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelations, is heavily coded. They use a lot of the language, symbolism, and categories that the Hebrews would know out of their own experience. And it is designed precisely to give hope to people in the midst of persecution and crisis. This is just a little vague to me, but I'm trying to recall the exact setting for the book of Revelation, but I think it had something to do with the persecution of Domitian at the end of the first century, when the Christians really were in bad straits, and they really needed to know how to hang on and to be able to keep going, and they were trying to help them along that line. Now that suggests that the book of Revelation doesn't say anything about the state of Israel in 1947 or the common market, but it had a precise purpose in the first century to deal with a very existential problem, persecution under the Roman emperor.
I think you hit right upon it when you said the purpose of the literature was to give people hope. And I suppose the difference between our interpretation of the book and the interpretation the fundamentalists would have of that book derives from our differing understandings of how it provides that hope. They would be much more likely to say that it provides that hope because it gives to us a clear, I can't really say literal, but I'll say it anyway, and then I'll correct that, a step-by-step explanation of the sequence of events that are going to happen before the end, so that by seeing how events today match up with that, we can come to a determination that yes, the world is going to end next week or 2 months from now or next year, and therefore can have the hope that we need to hang on because the end is going to come very closely, very, very soon. I think that the modern scriptural scholar today would approach the problem by saying that the form of literature that the apocalyptic authors used was indeed meant to convey hope to the people, but it did that not by intending to give a sequence of events that would be used as benchmarks to indicate the end coming at a specific date, but to portray that God was in control of history, that He's always been in control of history, and that just as He has been in control of history in the past, we can have just that assumption that He will also be in control of history in the future. One of the elements of apocalyptic that I find most significant is that it is invariably cast in the form of a vision or a dream that, because there's many, many more apocalyptic works than appear in the Bible, but the form of the literature always takes the form of a vision or a dream had by some person of the far distant past, in which he foresees what is happening in the present. And what is happening in the present is conveyed, as you said, by means of very abstruse and very complicated sometimes symbolism, but symbolism of a nature that the people who were living at the time could understand. It would be kind of as if someone would today say, say that they unearthed a letter in which President Lincoln had a dream, and he saw that in the ages to come there would be a peanut farmer who would be president, and he would be followed by a man who was an actor as president, etc., etc. And then it was after that God would make this definitive intervention in human history to rescue those who were unjustly treated and so forth. Because people could see through the symbolism elements or references to what was going on right then and there, they could have hope that all that was happening was under His control and for His purpose. Therefore, what would happen in the future also was by His design and under His providence. That is one of the ways that scholars today can date the various apocalyptic works, which remain undated, because it's at that point where the symbolism no longer matches exactly what did happen in history, where it becomes a little more vague. That's the point at which the writer was standing and had to use his own best judgment about how God was going to intervene and save His people, no question at all. But the specific modality that He would use, what events in terms of which this would happen, that He was using His own judgment like any of the rest of us would. It's at that point where we go from a direct correspondence with the acts of history to a more general scenario. Then we know that that's the point at which that person was standing and writing that particular
and that's one way we know how to date some of these books in the Bible. And the really operative point in what you were saying is that the hope was based on the utter conviction that God had saved the people in the past, had been with them in the midst of all of the crises of the past, and had gotten them through it. Therefore, one could count on this God doing this again. They would not be abandoned in the midst of their current struggles. So that the real basis of hope, therefore, is a faith that God is with you and is trustworthy and will never abandon us.
That's correct.
And I think that, that is really telling in terms of how we generally deal with the future. In other words, the future is that which is essentially unknowable to us. It is unknown and unknowable. The question is, where do you find your rock, your support, your security in a complex, changing world? Do you find it in rational planning, in knowing the exact sequence of events, in knowing the precise endings of things? Or do you do it by this general trust in God that whatever happens, this God will be with you throughout it? And I think that is really a great difference in mindset, in outlook on life. And I would suggest that the only real way to deal with the future is in that second way, by believing there is a God in the future, a God out front of us who's drawing us ahead, alluring us into the future, and sustaining our effort as we move in that direction. A God who's trustworthy and won't abandon us. I believe that's the only real basis. And again, you're back to saying that there are psychological factors, therefore, that enter into the way we end up reading the Bible and which things jump out at us. And the presupposition, again, would be very different for those who follow modern biblical criticism than those who fall into the camp of what we are calling here the millenarianists.
Yes, I think, and I agree with you that the trust and the fidelity of God is the thing that will allow us to grapple with the future and have confidence in our as we move from every moment from the present to the future. I think that the biggest threat to that way of understanding what's going on is if it can be shown, or if the perception is that God has not been faithful in the past. And therefore, when current history seems to be giving the message that God has forgotten about His people, or that they are being treated unjustly by the events of history, an author who wants to affirm the fidelity of God is going to have to show that even what is happening today, as evil as it may appear on the surface, is in fact in line with God's providence, and that there's a reason for all that happens, whether we happen to know it or not. And that, again, accounts for another aspect or another element of the apocalyptic approach, in which all of history is portrayed as having been set right from the very beginning by God. He's got a plan on all these details. We may not know it, but, up to this point we may not have known it, but there is a plan, and all these things have explanations. What the apocalyptist does is to reveal, that's the meaning of the Greek verb from which it takes its name, is that he reveals to us this plan, and therefore we can see that just as He's been faithful throughout, He will also be faithful now in the future.
Ken, when we begin to look at what the millenarianists say, it gets quite detailed in many ways. Just to sketch out a sort of popular scenario that you sometimes see, it talks about Christ coming soon. Again, He'll be back around, and it won't be long. the saints or genuine Christians will be snatched mysteriously up into heaven in what is called the rapture. People, the good people, will be taken up out of the world, and 144,000 Jews will be converted, and they'll become the main messengers of Christ in establishing now this 1,000 years of peace. Well, that's things you hear people talk about these days. The rapture, the number 144,000, which is a biblical number, that exists in our world today. I mean, it may sound preposterous, but I know that individuals that I've counseled not too long ago, were dealing with others, spouses in some cases, who thought the rapture was going to come and were afraid their spouse would not be in the group snatched up into heaven and preserved from all of this. So this enters right into family life or ordinary existence these days.
I think what's intriguing about that is that very concept of the rapture is designed as a solution to the problem that these texts have not worked out literally. Because the assumption that it goes back to John Nelson Darby back in the 19th century, 1827 to 1870 something. He made a number of trips to the United States. He was an Irishman himself, but made a number of trips to the United States popularizing this idea. And what it has in its essential is that when the Jewish people, this is the way they phrase it now, not I don't think it's correct, but it's the way they phrase it, that when the Jewish people rejected Jesus as their Messiah, God stopped the clock. And therefore, all those passages from Scripture that they assume give this literal sequence of events, step by step, what's going to happen, that has now been put on hold until such a time as the rapture occurs. At that point, the clock starts up again, and then the Scriptures continue to be given accurate step-by-step sequence of what's going to happen. So, because there's no dating for when the rapture will occur, that allows them to hold on to that same assumption that the Scriptures in both Daniel and Revelation do give this detailed sequence, and yet not have to worry about the facts of history messing up the scenario. One of the reasons that Hal Lindsey in his late great Planet Earth is rejected by many fundamentalists is because he broke the rules. He said that the events are already now taking place, and you alluded to some of those at the beginning about the establishment of the State of Israel, for example. That right away puts you back now into history, and then you're committed to having everything work out exactly as those texts portray, and of course it's not happening, and that weakens the faith. The correct solution is to say that it's on hold until the rapture, and then we can, at that point, it will once again take up.
Start to count again.
Yes.
Then, Ken, I think that it's important for us to think about how people avoid getting trapped into this kind of thinking, or how we help people to be able to see through some of this. Now, one of the clear ways is to understand the literary form in the book of Revelation, I think, as you've pointed out, and this apocalyptic literature and so on. Another thing maybe it would be to arm people with certain texts in a way. Jesus in Mark 13:32 says that, of course, he doesn't know when the end of the world coming. Neither the angels nor the Son of Man knows this, but only God. I often find it interesting to say to those people, I find it fascinating that you know more than Jesus did about this ending of the world. Jesus professes that he doesn't know when this is happening, only the Father.
How do they respond?
Well, not well. I mean, this is not calculated to enhance dialogue, but it's something, in other words, we need to sort of arm people in a way to know how to deal with what can be a very enticing worldview here, that there's elements in the Scriptures that would call this into question in a way. And I think the other thing is to point out that, there's other ways of dealing with the future. That what we need to have is trust in God, a confidence that God is with us throughout all of this. So maybe some of those things help. I think, too, maybe we try to help people deal with the fascination of the group that emerges around these issues. There's a lot of emotional fuzzies, warm fuzzies, as people say, that comes from being involved in some of these groups that have the absolute truth. And I think we have to provide supportive communities for people. Our parishes have to be a place where really people could feel comfort and strength so they can face an unknown future. I think we have to have parishes where there's a strong emotional cast to the religion, where people feel as though they belong and that they're part of it, and that it's something that is enriching to them.